Welcome to Manage to Engage, the podcast from clearandopen.com, dedicated to the evolution of you because businesses grow when people do. Serving leaders, managers, and people who will be, helping you reach excellence in your work and achieve your personal goals at the same time. Sign up for the free course at clearandopen.com. We're so conditioned with non-apologies like this that where's the leadership for remorse supposed to come from? And then other questions like, what does it look like for a leader to apologize? Hi, it's Joseph, and thanks for tuning in to Manage to Engage, the podcast from clearandopen.com. In this episode, we start a three-part series on how to apologize. Specifically, this part discusses the anatomy of non-apologies and how to spot them immediately. You know, we don't learn about the art of apologizing as children or in school. In fact, the process still eludes most grown adults, maybe even your employees, business associates, maybe even your significant other falls into this category. Here we discuss specific examples of non-apologies in the media and across the political spectrum. This episode is a recent weekly member webcast. For more information about the many benefits of Clear and Open membership and how to get the help you need in conversations like this, please go to clearandopen.com. Thanks so much for listening. Now let's dive in.
I'll just share that I had felt more challenged this week than the past couple of weeks. I believe the assignment was to look at some of the problems that we're working on as part of the class and see if there was a place to feel remorse, which is what we talked about last week. I did eventually do that, but I found it a bit of a challenge to face up to. Well, part of it was the fact that it required me to go back and do some unfinished homework from previous weeks. I also felt the need to, when I finally settled on something, that I could see the negative impact I had had on one of my employees and identified that, then the next thing, a logical thing, was to talk about that and acknowledge that with that employee. And I haven't done that yet. I made a small reference to it yesterday, but I see that there's more that I need to and want to do about that, and it's a bit of a challenge. But so that's just what came up for me.
I appreciate you sharing all that. I'm sure you're not the only one who's experiencing difficulty. Is the difficulty unproductive or is it desirable difficulty? Desirable difficulty is a technical term in modern education theory that says it's actually helping you learn. I don't mean, would you like some more?
Yeah. I would have to classify it as productive comfort. Yeah.
Good.
I actually did address that today in an oblique way because I talked to my production manager about goals that I had personally to improve the way in which I prepare information for him when I sell a job. Mm-hmm. I'm just kind of wondering now, back to a couple of hours ago, whether I actually expressed remorse or whether I sidestepped it by just saying what I wanted to do differently, because I realized that it was difficult for him to do his job properly if I didn't do that.
As usual, Peter, you set me up perfectly for segues. By the end of today, you're going to know exactly how well you express that remorse.
Okay, let the games begin.
None at all, or none at all of it, or in part. But certainly, it was at least in part, because
right.
That's what we're going to talk about today. Is sort of the architecture of remorse, how to apologize, which I think is the coolest use of the CLEAR acronym that I've come up with so far. You know, maybe if I come up with too many uses of the CLEAR acronym, it'll just obfuscate the whole thing and be ridiculous. But so far, I think it's not yet overused. Okay, I want to start by reading pieces of an article from NPR in May of 2013. I'll just read some pieces of it here. It's going to reference something that happened right around there. And it doesn't go into a lot of depth about it. And I'll add some commentary as needed. Make no mistake, the acting commissioner of the IRS put himself in historic company Tuesday by writing in USA Today that, quote, mistakes were made when his agency singled out for extra scrutiny some conservative groups. This was big news at the time. Of course, Luann, the CPA, remembers. This is the equivalent of racial profiling by the IRS. It was pretty big news at the time. No less an authority on language than the late William Safire in his Safire's Political Dictionary devoted an entry to the oft-used phrase, this is the phrase mistakes were made, describing it as a, quote, passive evasive way of acknowledging error while distancing the speaker from responsibility for it. Beautifully defined. Political analyst Bill Schneider declared it to be the, quote, past exonerative. I love that. The past exonerative of choice for the political class. Seeing it used again sets us off on a search of the phrase's origin and history. As On the Media is reported, quote, the magical construction, I love the jokes they make about this, the magical construction, that's the past exonerative, was popularized during Watergate by Nixon spokesman Ron Ziegler in 1973. He apologized to the Washington Post's Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, some of the original investigative reporters who blew that whole case open. He apologized, for example, saying that, quote, mistakes were made in terms of comments, unquote, that the White House had made about the Post and the reporters. Sound like remorse? It famously came up again in December 1986. President Reagan conceded that, quote, mistakes were made, end quote, by his administration when it sold arms to Iran and shipped the proceeds to Contras in Nicaragua. Reagan used the phrase again a month later in his 1987 State of the Union. President Clinton, a Democrat, proved in 1998 that Republicans aren't the only ones who know a good non-apology apology when they hear one. Asked about a fundraising scandal, he responded that, quote, mistakes were made here by people who did it either deliberately or inadvertently. I love that. That pretty much covers the whole spectrum. Like, they either did it on purpose or not. Either way, mistakes were made, certainly. Yeah. Republicans picked up the ball again during George W.'s administration. As Safire wrote, Bush added a, quote, skillful refinement, the subordinate clause admission or error, compounding passivity and present perfection with a conditional whatever, end quote. Speaking, isn't that gorgeous? You don't hear language like this much very often. Speaking of the Iraq War, Bush said in 2006 that, quote, whatever mistakes have been made in Iraq, the worst mistake would be to think that if we pulled out, the terrorists would leave us alone. Now, this apology, I want to do a sidebar for a second and say it one more time because it deserves a little bit more attention. This takes non-apology to a new extreme. Let me read it again. Quote, whatever mistakes have been made in Iraq, the worst mistake would be to think that if we pulled out, the terrorists would leave us alone. So that's not only not a specific admission of a mistake, but it's saying, actually, we don't think overall that it was a mistake, right? It's saying we needed to do this, and there were some smaller mistakes inside the way we did it. But what's fascinating to me about that non-admission of a mistake is it's great marketing, because if someone wants to hear an admission of guilt badly enough, they'll hear it in that, but it's not. And that's why it's such brilliant marketing. I mean, somebody must have spent an hour crafting that sentence. They're like, well, a lot of people are really upset about this whole Iraq war, and you didn't find any weapons of mass destruction, and people died and lots of money wasted. You're going to have to admit some mistakes here, Mr. President. Okay, well, how are we going to do that without actually admitting a mistake? I just wish I could have been a fly on the wall in that conversation. How do we satisfy the people who are upset and think this was a mistake, and also satisfy the people who don't think it was a mistake? How do we get both realities which don't go together in this case? How do we get that to go together?
And justify screwing up.
Yes, admit guilt, justify screwing up without really losing face, without actually changing the opinion, without having to change our foreign policy. You know, it's so we can invade another country, in a couple of years. And that's what they came up with. Let me read it one more time. Whatever mistakes have been made. So like whatever they are. Now that's fascinating, right? Because it's in one way all inclusive, whatever mistakes, whatever, all of them, whatever mistakes that happen without naming a single one, right? It's genius. Only a shadow can come up with clever stuff like this. I mean, it's ingenious. Whatever mistakes have been made in Iraq, the worst mistake would be to think that this would be worse than any of those, all of those, which I won't specifically mention. But the worst mistake would be to think that if we pulled out, the terrorists would leave us alone. So it leaves you thinking, well, sure, mistakes happen. Not going to talk about them, but it's better than this other mistake. Wow. Social engineering.
It sounds really logical too,
Yeah.
Weird.
You're right, Tyler. It does. It's like, oh, well, yeah, that makes sense because we had to do that and make those mistakes. Hey, nothing's perfect because this other thing might have happened otherwise. You can make a case for that, and of course he did, and many people did.
But so let's go on. Fall under logical fallacy.
Yes, great call, Victor. What logical fallacy would it be? It's a slippery. Implicit in there is a slippery slope thing, right? If we pulled out, the terrorists wouldn't leave us alone. There's a speculation there. I have a nose for logical fallacies a lot better than I do actually knowing the specific terms for it. But the assumptions implicit there are: we know what would have happened if we'd pulled out. This is what we had to do. And it also, very implicit in that is a definition of what the root problem, an assertion of what the root problem was.
It's also a redirect though too.
Yes,
a direction away from it's not actually acknowledging any of the problems. It's saying, look at this potential one that could have happened if we wouldn't have done this too. So, to Tyler's point, it sounds logical on the surface, but then when you actually think about it, it doesn't sound logical. At all.
For sure. And what's I think most sort of disgraceful or dishonorable about this is it lacks spine. Like, look, if you think you should have invaded Iraq, then stand behind that, all the way, and don't make excuses. And if you think it was a mistake, then admit it was a mistake. But this is a muddy middle. I would rather have a president justify it up and down and say this is exactly what we needed to do, which was like how Vietnam was talked about. We must stop communism. We can't give an inch, like that. There was no spine like that with Iraq. Not nearly as much.
It actually, this is off topic. Well, not really. It actually reminds me of The Office when Michael runs over Meredith, but then thinks it's a good thing because they found out that she had rabies and then he has a fundraiser for her rabies.
Exactly. I think history will show as things unfold, it's like that level of absurdity, we're getting closer and closer to it, right? All you got to do is watch that movie, Idiocracy. But you're right. That's just a little crazier what Michael Scott did. It's just, it's getting more and more feasible that things like that could happen. That was certainly one of the finest Office moments. Yeah. Okay, so let's push on here. This is almost the end. And then a year later, Bush's attorney general said mistakes were made in the firing of U.S. attorneys. They asked the question, where did this all begin? All the way back to Ulysses S. Grant, who said, appended a note to his final annual report to Congress in 1876, acknowledging the scandal that had plagued his 2 terms in office with the words, quote, "Mistakes have been made, as all can see, and I admit." That's another really interesting one. Like everybody sees the mistakes that have been made. Parentheses, we're not going to name them, talk about them, but I admit the mistakes were made. Right? Sounds really honorable. So, yeah. And then the article closes, I have to say, if you know of earlier references, please tell us. And if there were any errors in this post, ... well, you know what we'll say. Really cute, poignant, and painful article. Well, you can laugh, cry, or get angry, right? So I bring this today because these are quote unquote, supposed admissions, quote unquote, apologies from the leaders of our country. And we're so conditioned with non-apologies like this that where's the leadership for remorse supposed to come from? And then other questions like, what does it look like for a leader to apologize? Because in every single one of these circumstances, I guarantee you what's going through the heads of the people coming up with the phraseology is they're saying, well, we have to appear strong for the American people, or, we can't let people doubt the institution of the IRS or whatever. We can't, collapse and let people down in some way. And there's, of course, truth to that. When you're in an authority position and you're admitting guilt, it's different. The sort of rules and guidelines are different than if you're in a peer relationship. That's a domain specificity thing. I would agree that there's a difference there, and it's tricky. Unfortunately, that difference people grab and run with, and they use it as a justification because they tell themselves, well, I need to appear strong. We need to look like we've got a spine here. Need to appear as if, that's sort of the clue. We need to appear strong. Well, are you actually strong? Don't know, but I definitely know I have to appear it, right? Because the fear is of course, that if any president truly admitted a mistake, and I can't think of any president that has ever expressed remorse in a way that would really satisfy me, or any business leader, in the public sphere. I can't think of one. There may be some, but you don't hear about it very often. What usually happens, like remember the BP oil spill in the Gulf, the CEO, quote, took responsibility. How? By resigning. And then we're supposed to think like, oh, justice has been served. Like as if he was the one operating the drill, or he was the project manager of that project. I don't get how was him resigning supposed to make everybody feel better? And so you can't talk about remorse without talking about the very subtle topic of justice. What is justice? What makes us feel? Because justice is very much a feeling. What makes us feel that justice has been served? One thing I would invite you to consider is that real justice is so rarely meted out in our world that we've sort of lost our compass for what it should feel like, what we're authentically and reasonably desiring to happen, and then what actually happens. We're just kind of lost with it. I mean, we still live in a world where all you got to do is dial up, your bank or your insurance company, and 5 minutes later you can hear the phrase, "I'm sorry if there was any inconvenience." I mean, this is one of the most basic, obvious things I can think of. If the apology has the word "if" in it, it's not an apology. I mean, I don't understand that at all. If I've been telling you about my inconvenience for the last 10 minutes, that's the best you can. This happened, you caused this, you dropped this ball, and now you say you're apologizing if there was an inconvenience? Have you been listening? That's a non-apology that is written into so many scripts for so many tens of thousands of bank, insurance company, and other similar kinds of businesses. It's absurd. Thanks for listening to Manage to Engage, the Clear and Open podcast. Join us next week when you'll be a little bit closer to who you're destined to be. Until then, know that Clear and Open is dedicated to the evolution of you, because businesses grow when people do. Be sure to visit clearandopen.com for the latest tools, articles, and free resources to help you on your journey. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.